The first time I saw the hospital staff's faces, I knew my life would never be the same. My husband Daniel, the man who had been my world, was gone. 4 days ago, a sudden heart attack had taken him from me while I was at work. I remembered the call from the hospital, the disbelief that froze me in my office chair, and the way my hand shook as I tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned cruelly silent. I am Claire Hartman, 29, a widow living in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. I had always considered myself patient, cautious, and quietly strong. Daniel and I had built a life full of love, small joys, and shared dreams. He was kind, protective, and endlessly thoughtful, always noticing the little things that made me smile. The house we shared was filled with his laughter, our conversations echoing late into the night, and memories I thought would last forever. Now all of that was gone, leaving a hollow ache that had barely begun to settle. When I returned home after the funeral, I was not greeted by comfort, but by hostility. Waiting in the living room were the people I had always called family, though now they felt like strangers and worse, enemies. My sister-in-law, Clara, leaned against the doorway with a polite smile that barely concealed her satisfaction. My brother-in-law, Jeremy, stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes sharp with judgment. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, sat in the armchair with an expression of calm detachment, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she were conducting a careful inspection. And then there was Cousin Melissa, who had always pretended to be friendly, now glaring at me with quiet contempt. "You should start packing," Clara said, her tone cold, precise, and practiced. 4 days since Daniel had been ripped from me, and already they were trying to erase me from the only home we had shared. I froze, my chest tightened with disbelief, a quiet rage beginning to simmer beneath the surface. They had always tolerated me, sometimes envied me, but now they were moving openly, as though my grief made me weak and invisible. Yet, beneath the shock, a strange clarity emerged. I began noticing things I had ignored in the past, the subtle glances, the small criticisms, the envy carefully hidden behind polite smiles during family gatherings. They had been waiting for this moment. They believed I was powerless. The house itself, the home Daniel and I had built together, reminded me of what they were trying to take. Every photograph, every note tucked away, every book on the shelves was a testament to the life we had shared. And now they believed all of it could be taken from me with a few words. That night, I sat in Daniel's favorite chair, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. I could not cry, not yet. My grief had transformed into something sharper, disbelief, anger, and a quiet, simmering rage I had never let myself feel before. I remembered the little ways they had belittled me over the years. Clara's subtle criticisms, Jeremy's patronizing remarks, Evelyn's favoritism toward her other children, Melissa's occasional backhanded compliments. And suddenly, it all became clear. They had assumed I was weak. They believed I would bend, obey, and leave without resistance. They had misjudged me completely. The next morning, I began observing, analyzing, and recording every word, glance, and subtle move, every weakness, every hidden desire. Every crack in their carefully constructed facades became ammunition. When Evelyn knocked on the door to check if I had started packing, I met her gaze calmly. "I have thought about it," I said softly, "and I have decided I will not be leaving." Her face froze. Disbelief, anger, panic, all were there, fleeting but unmistakable. They had assumed 4 days of grief would make me surrender. Yet they had awakened something they could not control. A widow who had seen the enemy, studied the battlefield, and begun to plot quietly, meticulously, and ruthlessly. That night, I lit the fireplace and opened my journal, pen in hand. I documented every conversation, every betrayal, every subtle manipulation. Every detail would matter. Every weakness would be used. And as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, I felt the first flicker of power returning, not loud, not obvious, but precise and unstoppable. They had forced me out 4 days after my husband died, but they had made the fatal mistake of awakening a force they could not control. The war had quietly begun, and I, Claire Hartman, was ready to fight not with blind anger, but with patience, strategy, and ruthless precision. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension that had filled the house. Over the past 4 days, I sat in Daniel's chair, the firelight flickering across the walls, throwing shadows that looked like ghosts of memories past. Every corner seemed to whisper his absence back to me, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe in the stillness. But calm never lasted for long. Not in a house filled with people who had spent years pretending to care while quietly undermining me. As soon as the front door clicked behind Evelyn and Clara, leaving the room briefly empty, I rose and began a careful survey. My eyes traced the familiar layout of the living room, the sofa where Daniel used to read every evening, the coffee table cluttered with our shared magazines and notes, and the small stack of letters I had yet to open from friends offering condolences. Every object reminded me of him, and every object was now a potential witness to the strategy I would need to reclaim my life. I began by taking stock of the family, the players in this unspoken war. Clara, the sister-in-law who always thrived on control, had her eyes on the inheritance and the house itself. Jeremy, her brother and my husband's younger sibling, carried arrogance that made him underestimate me, thinking a grieving widow could be manipulated into silence. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, the matriarch, was subtle yet ruthless, her cold efficiency allowing her to orchestrate events without drawing attention. Melissa, the cousin who had once seemed friendly, was eager to curry favor, aligning herself with Clara to secure her own advantage. And then there was me, Claire Hartman, young widow, underestimated and overlooked, but no longer naive. Daniel's death had left a void, yes, but it had also revealed the battlefield. Every word they had spoken, every slight glance, every whispered comment over the past 4 days had become a data point. I realized that they had underestimated the quiet patience and meticulous planning I had inherited from Daniel himself. By the next morning, I had begun to act. Without their noticing, I requested a few days off work, citing the need to handle estate matters. In truth, I spent every waking hour observing, noting, and documenting. One tracked who entered the rooms, how they moved, and the subtle signs of their intentions. Clara began moving cautiously, aware I was no longer the timid presence she had assumed. Jeremy attempted to assert dominance, but I caught the hesitation in his voice. Whenever he spoke to me, Evelyn maintained a composed exterior, but small tics, a tightening of her jaw, a flick of her hand betrayed her frustration. Melissa was the easiest to read. She tried to emulate Clara's behavior, but her eagerness made her predictable. The first real confrontation came 3 days after my decision to stay. Clara approached me in the kitchen, arms crossed, her smile tight and artificial. "I hope you understand," she said smoothly, "that this house and Daniel's belongings are not yours to claim entirely. You must consider the family." I looked her in the eyes. keeping my voice calm, steady, and deliberate. "I understand perfectly," I said, though the words barely contained the tension coiling in my chest. "And I am not leaving. I will sort through everything carefully." As Daniel would have wanted, her expression faltered. The smirk she often wore vanished, replaced with subtle irritation. She had expected me to crumble, to beg for mercy, to silently comply. Instead, she was confronted with a quiet but unyielding resistance. Jeremy, witnessing the exchange from the hallway, stepped closer, his presence a shadow of intimidation. "You need to think about what you're doing," he warned, voice low. "This isn't just your house anymore. You need to be realistic." "I am being realistic," I replied evenly. "I will not allow 4 days of grief to determine the outcome of a lifetime of memories and love. I will not surrender." Even Evelyn, who had remained silent, observed from the doorway, her eyes calculating. I felt no fear, only awareness. She would try to manipulate, to outmaneuver, but she had underestimated me. The days that followed became a subtle battlefield. I began cataloging the contents of the house, identifying valuable items, and creating a mental map of leverage points: financial, emotional, and social. I remember conversations Daniel had with me over the years, his warnings about family politics, the advice to be patient, to observe before acting, and I realized that patience was now my greatest weapon. Clara attempted minor provocations, moving personal items, implying that Daniel's will might favor her, leaving subtle threats in conversations meant to unsettle me. Jeremy tried to assert dominance by controlling access to the garage and the car, but each move he made was carefully recorded in my journal. I wrote down names, dates, actions, intentions, everything. Because in this house, knowledge was power. Melissa, believing she could intimidate me with whispers and half-truths, became a source of amusement rather than threat. I watched her carefully, noting her need for validation from Clara, the way she flinched when I ignored her, and the way her eagerness made her predictable. She was a pawn, and like all pawns, she would fall first. One evening, Evelyn called me to the dining room under the pretext of discussing estate documents. The room smelled faintly of Daniel's favorite dinner, roasted chicken, and vegetables, but the warmth of the meal could not mask the tension in the air. She handed me the papers, with her usual composed expression. "We want to ensure everything is handled properly," she said, voice measured. "I hope you will cooperate fully." I took the documents, flipping through them slowly, carefully noting every clause, every name, every opportunity. I looked up at her, calm and deliberate, and said, "I will cooperate, of course. But I will also ensure that Daniel's wishes are honored, fully and fairly." Her subtle twitch betrayed her. She had believed I would sign without scrutiny, trusting her to manage things as she pleased. But now she was confronted with the reality of a widow who was not broken, a woman who had learned to watch, analyze, and anticipate. That night, I returned to Daniel's chair and journal, pen in hand. I wrote down every interaction, every slight, every manipulation I had witnessed. I began outlining plans, not reckless, not hurried but deliberate, strategic. The fire crackled beside me, shadows stretching across the walls like the consequences I was preparing for each family member. I realized something crucial. They had forced me out 4 days after my husband's death, expecting compliance. Instead, they had awakened a force they could not understand. The war had begun quietly, but I would escalate it with precision. Each small victory, every observation, Every subtle correction of their assumptions would be a step closer to the justice I intended to claim. As I closed my journal, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of immediate triumph, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing I was in control of the next moves. Clara thought she could intimidate me. Jeremy believed he could outmaneuver me. Evelyn believed she could manipulate me with subtle authority. Melissa believed her whispers would influence me. They were all wrong. And I, Claire Hartman, would ensure they realized their mistakes. One by one, carefully, ruthlessly, and without mercy, they would pay for underestimating the woman who had lost everything, but had gained clarity, strategy, and unbreakable resolve. The night deepened, silence enveloping the house, but in that quiet, I heard the beginning of my victory, the subtle sound of power returning, slow and deliberate, like a shadow moving across the walls. The battle had begun. The sun rose over Atlanta with the same calm that had always fooled outsiders into thinking life here was peaceful. But inside my home, the tension had reached a boiling point that no amount of morning light could dispel. 4 days after Daniel's death, my in-laws had expected me to crumble. But now, almost a week later, the quiet widow they assumed was powerless had transformed into something they could not anticipate. I walked through the house deliberately, my steps slow but purposeful. The scent of Daniel's favorite coffee lingered in the kitchen, and I allowed myself a brief pause, remembering him the way he smiled when I teased him, the subtle warmth of his hands in mine, the quiet strength he carried. Those memories were no longer just comfort, they were fuel. Every thought of what had been taken from me added precision to the strategy I had spent days formulating. Clara entered the kitchen first, as usual, trying to assert dominance. "Have you decided yet?" she asked, voice sharp, eyes scanning me as if trying to read weakness. I turned to her slowly, keeping my expression calm, almost serene. "I have decided," I said softly, letting the weight of my tone fill the room, "that I will not leave this house. These memories, Daniel's legacy, they belong to me, and I will ensure no one disregards them." Clara's smirk faltered, replaced by visible frustration. She had been expecting compliance, maybe even tears, but she found only unwavering resolve. And for the first time, doubt crossed her eyes. Jeremy hovered behind her, jaw tight, trying to appear imposing, but the subtle twitch in his hand betrayed irritation and uncertainty. It began with small, deliberate moves. I contacted Daniel's attorney to review the will, discovering a clause Clara had assumed was unnoticeable. A clause giving me explicit rights over certain assets and the home itself. I quietly ensured that all financial matters required my consent, giving me leverage they had never anticipated. Every document I signed, every phone call I made, every interaction with banks and estate planners was calculated, invisible. A chess game one controlled while they believed they still held power. Then came the public humiliation. A calculated confrontation designed not for anger, but for precision. Clara had invited friends over, hoping to show me as weak, indecisive, and incapable. I arrived calmly, dressed simply but with an aura of authority, and spoke with perfect poise, correcting errors in her presentation, highlighting financial miscalculations, and gently but firmly asserting my authority over decisions she had tried to dominate. The friends' subtle glances, questions, and whisperings shifted the balance. Clara's frustration was palpable, her whispered protests unheard by anyone but me. Jeremy attempted a private intimidation later that afternoon, cornering me in the study, You're playing a dangerous game, he hissed, voice low. This house is not yours to control. I met his glare without flinching. Dangerous? I echoed calmly, leaning slightly toward him. I call it justice. 4 days after my husband's death, you believed you could erase me, undermine me, and seize what was never yours. You underestimated me. That was your first mistake. This is merely the consequence. His face went pale as he realized that I had anticipated every attempt to intimidate me, had countered every move, and was now holding all the power he had assumed he possessed. The next day, I invited Evelyn to a family meeting under the guise of discussing final arrangements. The documents I placed before her detailed every financial and property matter with explicit clarity. I am ensuring that Daniel's wishes are fully honored, I said softly, my calm tone carrying weight. Any decisions made without my knowledge or consent will not be valid. Evelyn's composure cracked. A flicker of fear, thinly veiled as disappointment, crossed her face. She had assumed control, only to realize that the very widow she had sought to displace had mastered the rules of the game and turned them against her. Melissa, eager to please Clara and afraid of standing alone, tried to intervene with subtle comments, but each attempt backfired. I met her politely, guiding the conversation in a way that exposed her neophyte to the others while maintaining my authority. By the end of the meeting, every family member present had been forced to recognize a truth they had ignored for far too long. I was no longer vulnerable, no longer intimidated, and certainly no longer overlooked. By the end of the week, the balance of power had shifted entirely. Clara, Jeremy, Evelyn, and Melissa had all realized that the quiet widow they assumed was fragile had been meticulously planning, observing, and executing a strategy that left them powerless. Subtle public humiliations, private confrontations, and legal maneuvers had dismantled their confidence, exposing every flaw and insecurity they had relied upon. And then, in the quiet of the evening, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Sitting in Daniel's favorite chair, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. Revenge had been earned, executed, and witnessed not with shouting or anger, but with precision, patience, and strategy. The family that had tried to erase me from the life I shared with my husband had been forced to acknowledge my authority, respect, and determination. I lit the fireplace, journal in hand, and wrote down the final events. Every small victory, every observation turned advantage, every moment of control reclaimed was documented, not for pride, but as a testament to what I had endured and how I had overcome it. I paused, glancing at the photographs of Daniel on the walls. This was for him, yes, but also for me. I had survived the storm, and I had emerged stronger, smarter, and unbroken. The house was mine. The memories were mine. The respect once denied had been reclaimed. And though Daniel would never return, I had ensured that his legacy and my dignity would remain untouchable. As the flames crackled and shadows danced, I whispered to no one but myself. They forced me out 4 days after my husband died, but they did not know the storm they had awakened. Life can take everything in an instant, but strength is discovered in the quiet moments of observation and resilience. If someone tried to erase you from your life, or take what you loved, how would you fight back? Would you act immediately or wait patiently for the perfect moment?